of this will really kind of echo for a long time. So anything that we can do to support our public lands through the people who work to protect those public lands, I think is incredibly important. I think one point I wanted to share about probationary employees that I feel has been sometimes lost in this conversation is that oftentimes park and forest and fish and wildlife employees in these positions can be in seasonal positions for many, many years before they move up to a permanent position. That could be 6 years, it could be longer. So by the time someone is a probationary employee as a permanent staff member, they're already integral to the operations of the place where they're working. They're not someone who's typically coming on new to this job. So the people who are affected by these cuts are very important for the running of these parks and spaces. So the effects there, I don't think can really be understated. I mean, we're already seeing closures due to this and loss of access. And I certainly worry that as disrepair and like an inability to maintain and care for these places gets worse due to like inadequate staffing numbers, that may be misused as a motivation for the abuse of public lands. So I think being clear that the cut of that staffing was unacceptable is something that's very important. So this is our first QR code. It's for the Sierra Club portal where you can submit a comment showing your support for those people and yeah, outcry against what was done there. Anna?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and clarify too. There have been some reporting that kind of seemed misleading and made it think like, or maybe you think that the Trump administration reversed that decision. They have reversed or are going to maybe reverse their pause on seasonal hiring. They had also, in addition to laying off all of these staff, they had also paused the hiring of any seasonals, which if you visited a national park, you know that the summer seasonals are essential. So they are considering revising that and allowing for seasonal hiring to move forward, but they are not reversing yet the terminations. So that's just a key distinction. I've heard some people say, oh, like they're reversing the terminations, and that hasn't happened. It's kind of been misconstrued in the headlines. So I just wanted to make that point clear that we're still fighting for that.
That's a great point. And I think another element of this that's often misconstrued is when they talk about it not affecting fire because fire coded employees weren't affected. I think a lot of people are familiar with this, but so many of the people who work on fires aren't specifically coded as fire employees. They're people who have other main duties within the Forest or Park Service who then go out on fires. And they comprise a pretty large percentage of the labor force out on actual fires. So even if people who are fire coded are not let go, there's no doubt that this will affect wildland firework this coming summer. So very forest forum relevant in that sense. Great. So this is kind of our overview slide here of the 3 things we're going to be covering. We'll go over the monument review, which is currently happening, the Fix Our Forests Act, and a bit about the Northwest Forest Plan Amendment. So that's the overview there. So our monuments are up for review. There's the strong quotes there. So these are a few of the monuments in California I picked out because all of the monuments are up for review. Just to preemptively say that these are not in any specific danger, but it is so broad that it is covering all of our national monuments, including these in your state. So Secretary Burgum's first 6 secretarial orders directed officers within the Department of the Interior to offer more parcels of public land for oil and gas leasing. And as part of that has requested that ordered that they revisit and potentially revise protections for national monuments and other public lands. These monuments are areas that have been designated through the Antiquities Act and have these special protections, and they're some of our most beautiful and protected and special places. So putting them under review for the sake of more oil and gas leasing is certainly something that hurts my heart quite a bit. Anna?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm sure everyone here are, big fans of national monuments. And so you know how important these places are for recreation. A lot of them are, sacred sites for tribes. And it's just something that is awful to see, that they could try and reverse some of these designations. So the more people that can weigh in opposing this, the better. And we do think that this is something that can transcend, political affiliation as well. Outdoor recreationists are people all across the country. And so the more people that hear about this, I think the better, because a lot of Trump voters, quite frankly, I don't think really paid any attention to his agenda about public lands. They're more focused on the economy or immigration, and they just aren't really as familiar with his not just environmental, like climate wise, but public land specifically. A lot of conservative voters, really are recreationists, hunters, fishers, hikers. So I think the more we can elevate this issue broadly, the better, because it would be great to have people from across the political spectrum weighing in, because I really do think public lands are something that can unite us. So the
And
more the better.
I honestly think too that some of that posturing around potentially walking back the firings in national parks and forests is because that pressure is being felt. So I do think it's pretty meaningful. I know there was a huge amount of outcry around those firings, and now that they're starting to be like, oh, we might walk this, we'll see if we walk this back. I think that's that pressure working. So even though it can feel like we're in such an unfriendly time for these issues, I think that it is still extremely effective and very important to engage. I think it can be so discouraging when we feel like what we're doing isn't having an effect. And I feel like it truly is. It just really takes us pushing and building that momentum. So 2 more QR codes. Back to the links in the chat as well. So the first one here, we have a toolkit that we've put together with different ideas for actions that I'd encourage you to check out. This one is to tell Congress to keep polluters' hands off public lands. And it's kind of our general, has ways to write letters or to engage or contact representatives. It's a great go-to with all kinds of different resources on this issue. And then the lower QR code is to our direct portal. So you can submit a comment there and it will be directly mailed to your specific representatives, which is a great one to pass along as well. It just goes by where you're based to send it to the correct representatives. So even people who aren't super engaged with, say, who their representatives are or are newer to that issue, can still really easily engage through that portal. And it's also a broad enough message that it's not for one specific thing that's happening right now, it's for what's happening now and also for this whole fight to come. So I think that's a great one to share as broadly as we can. We are really encouraging people to post on their representative social media and to engage in the comments, even if we have representatives who aren't as friendly to our issues. If we can kind of break up that echo chamber, say in the comments on their posts, and start presenting some broader information and views and show that it's not as one-sided as it might appear, that's a pretty valuable tool right now. So we've definitely been encouraging that. This one says calling. I know we're leaning a bit more towards emailing right now, which is the lower one. I think people are getting so inundated that they've asked that we direct people to email a bit more, but that's also still getting counted and a great way to contact representatives. And the bottom one I think can sometimes be the hardest, but is perhaps, I think, the most important is, can we bring in friends, family, anyone who cares about these places, but maybe hasn't been involved in advocacy before? Some of these asks where it's more just like a link with a simple comment are a great way to bring those people in. I know my parents love the outdoors, but have never been super involved in advocacy. And I've been kind of forwarding these links along and bringing them into this conversation. And those easier steps to take can be great things for bringing more people in. And then this one I thought was super cute. There's a really lovely toolkit that got put together to write a love letter to your public lands. And I think it's such a great thing. It got originally put together for Valentine's Day specifically, but it remains so relevant. It's, let's all talk about how we engage with our public lands, whatever that means for us, wherever we may be, and just kind of talking about our experiences and sharing that love is such a positive way to engage in a time that can feel really dark. I think it's nice to check back in with those beautiful memories and those beautiful places. And I'd love to keep this ball rolling. So this is trying to get people to submit those love letters as letters to the editor, to share them as social media posts, and to just talk about how important our public lands are to us. So it's broad, but I think really beautiful. I'd love to bring back that sense of sort of warm positivity, not entirely the sort of negative doom and gloom. It can be so tiring to live in doom and gloom for years on end. Great, Anna.
Yeah, so the next thing that we'll talk about in this presentation is the Fix Our Forests Act. You've all probably seen at least one email, if not more than one, about this. Sierra Club and a lot of other environmental groups have done action alerts about this bill, but it is very misleading in the name, and there are three key issues that we have with the bill. So if you can go to the next slide, Leah, I can give a high-level overview. So the Fix Our Forest Act, or otherwise known as FOFA, is a really long bill. It's like 70 some pages, and there are quite a few sections that are fine, neutral, maybe even good. Of course, this is a Republican bill from Representative Westerman, so it doesn't include any funding for any of the positive sections. So even if it was passed, those positive sections wouldn't really do anything. But it's all to say it's kind of wrapped up in this package that is made to seem like a great bill that will help with forests and fire, but there are three really bad poison pills kind of tucked in there. And that is why we oppose the bill as a whole, because those three poison pills are just non-negotiables for us and for the rest of the environmental NGOs that we work closely with. And those three things kind of very top line are: number one, cuts to NEPA, or National Environmental Policy Act; number two, cuts to the Endangered Species Act; and number three, harmful judicial review provisions. So I won't get too much into the weeds, but to give a little bit more detail on each of those, the NEPA section creates these huge fire sheds of 250,000 acres and allows for emergency authorities to kind of bypass NEPA and other environmental procedures to fast track essentially logging. They're framing it as fire management, but it would really be the logging of probably mature and old growth forests, because there is the money incentive for timber companies. So we're really concerned with how that might be used, and the loss of mature and old growth trees that we might see if those large acreage fire sheds were established. So that's our main concern there. The second one on the Endangered Species Act is something known as cottonwood, which is it's kind of a standalone piece of legislation that they have stuck in this bill that would essentially cut some of the current requirements under the Endangered Species Act to do more consultations on a certain habitat and threats to a species when climate change or something else has changed the habitat. It's really important to revisit forest management plans, but it's basically sidestepping that, which could mean that a logging project, they aren't aware of the concerns that it could pose to a species because they didn't reevaluate the plan like they were supposed to. So it's like creating a loophole in the Endangered Species Act, which NEPA and the ESA are two of our bedrock environmental laws. And so we don't want to see any legislation passed that could set precedent for further loopholes and further cuts to those. So that's the second. And the third one is really concerning. It's judicial review, and it would limit the time of injunction, or basically the time that a community group, a tribe, an individual, that if they try and stop a certain forest project, they only have 120 days to do so, which is an incredibly short window of time. Currently, it's 6 years, and it shortens it to 120 days. So that really is just cutting the public out of a really key piece of the checks and balances that we have. So that one is a really big concern as well. So those are the top three concerns. And unfortunately, Fix Our Forest did already pass the House this year. It Republicans introduced the bill, and without any committee process, they just brought it straight to the floor for a vote. And they did that because of the LA fires, because they knew that if they frame this bill as a bill that will help with wildfires, that'll create a lot of political pressure on Democratic members, especially those from California, to vote for it. So it was very opportunistically timed on their part, and very unfortunate, because not only would this bill not help with forest fires, the LA fires were not forest fires. That was an urban fire spread by wind, and a tragedy that could have been prevented via other means, especially home hardening, which we'll get to in a bit. But this bill is really not related to that at all. And so they were just capitalizing on a tragedy rather than supporting and trying to pass funding or other support for the LA communities. They passed a bill to increase logging. So it was unfortunate to see that. But the good news is, the legislation has not been introduced in the Senate yet. And so by weighing in with Senate offices, that's the key here. It's already passed the House, so those reaching out there is not really going to make a difference at this point. But we can reach out to senators, especially the California senators are really key offices, to share our opposition to the bill and to particularly raise these 3 poison pills, which is included in the action alert that we'll share in a moment. That could really help us move the needle and potentially even get these 3 poison pills removed from the bill, or at least try and prevent the bill from passing. So that is kind of the overview. Leah, if you can go to the next slide.
So let me just stop here for a moment and tell people that if you have a question for our speakers, please put it in the Q&A. And after they're done presenting, Kristen will ask some questions. So the Q&A is at the bottom of your screen. So, okay, sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No worries, thanks. Yeah, so we have 2 links here. First is our action alert that you can use to weigh in with your Senate offices to tell them that you oppose the bill. And another thing you can do similarly with all the other things is tell your friends and just help educate people, because of course the name Fix Our Forest sounds appealing. It sounds like it's a good idea. And especially when they're out in the media and in articles saying that this bill would help prevent fires like the ones in LA, which is just not true. It's really important to kind of shine a light on the real issues with this bill. So you can weigh in there. I also did include the link to an article about Fix Our Forest, which does a really good job diving in a bit deeper, but still at a high level with the issues. So that's just there if people want to read or share that article as well. And then the last thing that I'll point to, I kind of mentioned a bit earlier, we don't want to just tell members vote no on everything and not have any positive visions or positive solutions for what we want to see. And so what Sierra Club is really leaning into right now in the fire space is home hardening and community preparedness legislation. We've seen in fires like in Lahaina in Hawaii or the tragedies in LA, that is primarily driven by embers blowing house to house. And the most effective way to save homes and lives in that case is to have fire resistant homes and to have, brush and other things cleared from the direct vicinity of your home. So that is a really tangible and concrete action people can take, but it's expensive and not everyone can afford to do that. And so we're trying to promote legislation such as Representative Huffman's Community Defense and Wildfire Resilience Act, which would provide grant funding or other resources to communities to help people implement those changes so that the cost doesn't fall entirely on the homeowner. And those sorts of things. And then other preparedness items like better evacuation routes and planning, like doing the work in the community where people live is going to be the most effective thing. And then you can work outwards from there, potentially doing treatments, prescribed burns, and other things in the WUI. But a bill like Fix Our Forests, which would just be logging in the backcountry, is not what's going to save lives in the event of a fire. So we just want to be really clear about that, because that's the way this bill is being framed, unfortunately, and it does make it hard to fight against it when people are under the impression that this bill would help stop fires. So yeah, I think that's all I have there.
Yeah, that's great. It's so hard to get representatives to oppose something that has a name that sounds like they would be helping in a time when there's a lot of pressure on them to be helping out with this issue. So the more that we can show them that the public understands why this bill is a negative and does not want this, the better. So really spreading the word on this one for sure. Okay, and now we're at number 3. This is protecting the legacy of the Northwest Forest Plan. I feel like in this forum, we probably have a high percentage of people who are already somewhat familiar with the Northwest Forest Plan. So I'll give a brief overview, but I am not going to totally take you into the weeds on the original plan with me. So the Northwest Forest Plan, you can see this map up on the screen here. It is the Forest Service's plan. Now, it used to include the BLM as well, but now we're more in the Forest Service at this point because the BLM has since left this plan. But it covers the ways in which these forests are managed. And when it was originally established, it was really established as a focus on endangered species protection. So it was to do with habitat for these species. That was a major goal. And it also balanced in some ways the interests of the timber companies that had been operating in this region. So it's meant to balance all of these things, but the endangered species protection and the fact that it's helping out these places with the vision of how they operate as an ecosystem, not just as a timber product, is really crucial to the original plan and leads to a lot of our concerns with the amendment process, which is currently underway. So a big side note with the amendment process is that there are some positive opportunities for change with the amendment process. There are things we would like to see more of. It's been about 30 years since the establishment of the original Northwest Forest Plan. And in that time, a lot has changed. Global warming has gotten worse. We've seen wildfire intensities increase. So there is some amount of accounting for these things that should be taking place, but that doesn't just look like cutting trees. That looks like things like taking into account the importance of these areas for carbon storage in a time of global warming. That looks like looking at the values of these forests for clean water and healthy habitat, not just for profit. So there's a lot at play here. The other major component there was that in the original plan, tribes were completely neglected and left out of the process. So even though they've been occupying these places since time immemorial, they really were not brought into that plan. And because of that, they were essentially frozen out of being able to have any input on what was happening or interact with these spaces in meaningful ways. So these are things that could have been included in the amendments, and in some ways they have been. So those tribal components especially, there have been some pushes. We're looking for more for that to be truly meaningful, but it's there. The negatives, or there's a lot. There's different proposed alternatives, so it's not just one definite alternative at this point. This is a draft environmental impact statement that we're dealing with currently. And it opens up huge new areas to logging. It raises the minimum age at which many of these trees can be cut, which also opens up even further areas. The timber targets that it's naming are vastly increased from what they were before. And there's no addressing of the ways in which all of these changes would affect all of these species that were such a major focus of the original plan. It instead says that what they did the first time around is adequate, and that they aren't looking at that further, which seems quite inadequate given the massive changes. It also doesn't look at the value of forests for climate stability and carbon sequestration at all. It doesn't examine their worth and insane benefits for recreation and clean air and water and all these things that it does provide to these communities. It just looks at it as this purely sort of timber-based equation. Anna, do you have any thoughts on all this?
No, I think you did a good job covering it. Just in case you didn't mention this, I can't recall if you did. The Northwest Forest Plan is obviously primarily Washington and Oregon, but it does cover, as you see in the map there in the middle, a section of Northern California as well. So I know a lot of California folks are on this call. So I just wanted to raise that up, that it does include some California forests.
Yeah, it goes down towards Shasta Trinity. It gets pretty far down there. The map is a little hard to see specifically on here just because it's relatively small, but it is certainly, especially in those very dense, beautiful Northern California forests, very relevant to how these things are managed. So the Northwest Forest Plan itself, there's a comment period on the draft environmental impact statement that's open until March 17th. So we're really trying to drive comments on this. Part of this as well is just showing that people do care about forestry issues. I think the biggest fear that I have is that in a world where each of these things is under attack, that people would think that there aren't people watching out for and caring about these places. Because once that draft statement goes back for further changes, we want them to know that we are paying very careful attention to what direction that takes and what that looks like, so that it can't be co-opted in any way. So I think showing that people really care about these issues is deeply important and is going to continue to be. So this link here is to the toolkit. There's also a direct action page, and I have purposefully linked you all to the toolkit because I think you would be great people to write personalized comments about this. Some of you may have already submitted your own comments, but you can also submit multiple if you have more thoughts. But the Forest Service definitely counts unique comments on this much more heavily than a form comment. So anytime we can get someone to submit a unique comment here, that's super valuable. And what a unique comment could look like can vary a lot by person. I think there are people who could get very in depth on maybe the specific technical issues here. but also just being more in depth on your own personal experience with these places and why you're invested in them and care about them, and including that context is also deeply beautiful and valuable here. I think you can talk about the general themes, even if you don't feel as confident getting into the kind of finicky technical details. That's also great to show, like, I oppose these like higher timber targets, and I really value these places for recreation, and just including those details can be extremely helpful. So the toolkit kind of guides you through what some of the larger issues are with the amendment process, if you wanted to like look through those and see what resonates with you to include in your comment. And also just kind of gives you some general tips for comment writing for the Northwest Forest Plan in general. So that's there. Okay. And then this is just sort of a general thought at the end here, because I think the problem with trying to give all the tools right now in this moment is that a lot of this has just happened, and we are waiting and planning and coming out with new things so that we can be ready to act going forward. And we don't know all of what we're going to be facing in the next year at this point. That part of that is still in the works. And unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of responding to new attacks. There's going to be us needing to like organize and be able to respond to all of these things. So I think just being really ready to organize in this coming year is super important, especially for people who are already involved and committed on these issues. This is just like the ideas slide. What does that look like? I think more than anything, the bold at the bottom is what I would continue to emphasize is these are going to be long fights. These are going to require a lot of work from a lot of people coming together. And so often we can be in our own kind of corners of these issues, or in sort of smaller bubbles of people who already know about what's going on. And I think the more we can bring people in, the better right now, because we're going to need all of the help we can get. And I think, especially for people who are already involved in the Sierra Club, planning new activities that we can bring people into who are maybe newer to these issues is a great way to do that. That can look like if groups have outings happening, can we link those outings with some of these issues and with these action pieces? Could we table at events with postcards? Could we put out yard signs? Like, how can we increase the sense of visibility and the sense of urgency so that we can bring more people into this movement and help spread the word beyond ourselves? I think everyone who is willing to attend a forest webinar, likely already people who do deeply care, and you probably know someone that you could bring in as well. And that would, I think, be really helpful in the coming months. Anna, do you have any thoughts there?
I think you summed it up really well, but yeah, I just think it's important for us to continue to work together and continue to try and stay optimistic about these things. And the fact that in public lands specifically, we do have public opinion on our side. I kind of was talking about that a bit earlier, but there was a new poll done, the Rockies poll that comes out every couple of years about outdoor recreation and conservation, and even over 50% of self-identified MAGA voters still thought that protection of public lands was more important than oil and gas drilling on public lands. And that was amongst people that said that they were not only a Trump voter, but a MAGA supporter. So, you know, this is something that a lot of people really do care about. And that's something that helps me stay positive in the times that it feels like we're just swimming, you know, upstream and we have a lot working against us. We do, but people in this country really care. And the more that you can help spread the word about these things, I think more people will make their voices heard, and we can really make a difference. So it's good to try and stay positive.
Yeah, I think we had a lot to cover, so we kind of kept rolling on through, but very open to take some Q&A questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Leah and Anna. It's so nice to actually see you in person on the video, because I know that some of us have emailed it, especially a lot with Anna. So it's really nice that you're here and came to join us today. So I'm going to take questions both from the chat and from the Q&A. And it looks like the first question came through, which was, are you going to put the links in the chat again? I believe the answer is yes. Anna's already answered that.
Yeah, I think Leah, the ones you put at the very beginning, the folks that have joined since can't see those links. So if you would be able to paste them again in the chat so everyone has them. And we will also email them. We'll make sure Karen has them and can email them to the full group afterwards as well.
So that's great. And we'll make sure to get those out to you all, but it will be great if you take, it sounds like a lot of you want to take action now. So I'm grateful that you'll be taking action from the chat. So the second question, which was covered, but somebody was wondering, can we share the toolkits with the general public?
Yes, all of those were created as materials to be shared, so not only allowed, but highly encouraged.
And then someone asked about phone calls versus emails and was saying that 5calls.org is recommending phone calls to representatives because they get tallied, and asking, do you think emails are more effective?
Anna, you probably also have thoughts on this. I was hearing today that some people are getting, like, their systems are getting overwhelmed level with phone calls. But I do think that those tallies are a thing. If you can't get through on the phone for whatever reason, certainly give it an email. I also think emails are valuable as well. I think so often we can get caught up in what is the best way and then not end up doing anything. So if either of those feels easier to just go ahead and do, I would just encourage either over nothing, I think is always my thought. Anna?
Yeah, I interned on Capitol Hill during college, and they do have to track every email as well. That's what the interns are there for. So whether you weigh in via phone or via email, it is getting counted and tracked, and they sort it via issue area and all of that stuff. So either, if it feels like you're shouting into the void sometimes, but there are a team of interns that are keeping track of all of that.
Oh, that's really great to hear, Anna. And by the way, from personal experience, I did leave a voicemail and email on the Fix Our Forest Acts a couple of weeks ago, and I only had just a few short seconds, it felt like, to leave my issue on the voicemail. And so I felt it was good to get that out there, the really succinct idea. And then I followed up with a more point by point explanation as to why I was opposed to Fix Our Forest Act. So I think if you all have the time to write your letter and send the email, I think that would be great. What do you think, Anna and Leah?
Yeah, I think so too. The more the better. So if you can do both, that's also great.
Maybe
And if
start
you
with
can
whatever
only
feels
sign-
easier.
Go ahead.
Start with whatever feels easier to get the
I-
momentum going, and follow up with whatever feels harder.
I know, and we were also telling people, if you can only sign a petition, that's all you have time for, that's great too. Thank you.
Anything
Okay.
over nothing, always.
That is great. So, okay, here's another thought for potentially for improvement. Someone asked, why do environmentalists tend to speak to what we don't want, but not identify a paradigm of forestry, a different paradigm of forestry that harvests selectively and slowly? This may be a bit of a statement, but harvest selectively and slowly, where total utilization of all the resources is embodied in a job creating, ecosystem sustaining way.
Yeah, I had
So
actually, I had read that one through and thought it was interesting.
great.
I think so often the times when we're mobilizing people for things like this is when this plan has already been put out or this thing is already happening. And I think the places where those kinds of planning tend to happen are kind of in the in-between times. Which is why things like this committee are really valuable to keep people like engaged and thinking on these issues when it's not just addressing the one bill that's necessarily coming out in that moment. I think there are people in the world really engaged in trying to figure out that question. Which answer to it is the best, I think, is where it gets complicated, because I think there's a lot of different visions for what it looks like to balance all of these things together to have healthy forests and job creation and wildfire resilient forests. I think there's a lot of Indigenous groups actually doing some really interesting work, trying to kind of create fire resilient forests by using traditional Indigenous knowledge. Loma Katsi is the name of an organization that's doing some interesting work. So it does exist in the world. Whether or not you think their answer is the perfect one or there's another direction that could be taken, I think what's important is if we can all kind of continue to be collaborative on thinking through those issues, and realize that everyone who loves these forests has similar end goals in mind, even if sometimes the how we're getting there might be slightly different, because I think we're more powerful together. And I think sometimes we can get lost in this part and lose each other. So trying to find those points of connection and keeping that moving in times when there isn't a big threat. I think that's how we create that meaningful change. Anna, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think you covered it really well, and I mentioned this in the Fix Our Forest section, but also just reemphasize, like, in addition to a positive vision for like what forest management would be in the case of fire, we really are trying to refocus the conversation on what's needed in the built environment as the number one most direct way we can save lives in the events of fire, and that is just like urgent, and we need to be prioritizing that. So that's another like more proactive, positive vision that we have in the specific fire space.
I'd also say that sometimes these negative dichotomies feel manufactured to me, and that working against those visions can be helpful. Like a fire resilient forest is a healthy forest. We don't have to pick to sacrifice our forests to have fire resilient forests. So realizing that some of these things that have been put in opposition don't need to be, I think can create space for those more positive visions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I'm sure that will be a question that we'll all discuss at some other point as well. So one question, I'm not sure which part this was referring to, but one person asked, are only the brown sections under consideration or both brown and green? Do you remember what that was referring to? And if not, can the question asker speak up about that?
I think that was probably the Northwest Forest Plan map. Um,
Rob, feel free to ask your question because I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
it was so actually the green that's a little bit smaller is the reserved section, and the brown is the managed section. So it has to do with what level of protections each of those is receiving. So they're all managed underneath of it, but some are more protected than others, if that makes sense.
So both the brown and the green are kind of at risk, only in different ways.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
there's nothing where it's gonna like wipe out the brown. It's much more about kind of it by increasing the age at which trees become protected. Now all of a sudden, all of these stands younger than that become open to these cuts. So it's instead of being kind of large, it can end up being large swaths and areas, but it's less of a geographic boundary and more of by changing the rules, it's creating these vulnerabilities in pretty broad areas.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Leah. So another question that came up is, do you know when the Fix Our Forests Act will come to the Senate floor? And also, is that bill in a committee now, and which one?
Yeah, so luckily it actually has not been introduced in the Senate yet. We hear that Senator Hickenlooper from Colorado is interested in introducing it and has been working with Senator Sheehy on the Republican side, but they are still in the drafting period. And so that's why weighing in now is super helpful, especially with the California senators, because we know that Padilla and Schiff, as the senators from California, and especially in the wake of the LA fire, people are looking to them on this issue. And, Hickenlooper really cares about their opinions. And so if Padilla and Schiff are going into those meetings and saying, we want these 3 poison pills removed from this bill, we have a larger chance of that happening. So it is still very much in the drafting phase. We're just trying to raise as much noise opposing it as we can to make the version that gets introduced in the Senate the best possible version. And once we see that text, we can know whether it's something, maybe we could be neutral on it if all 3 of those poison pills are removed. If they're not, we're going to have to continue to oppose it, but we'll have to do so according to what the text actually looks like, because we are hoping that it is going to be very different from the House version. And as far as committees, last year it got referred to the Agriculture Committee because that does take a lot of forest issues. But it could also be referred to Energy and Natural Resources, just depending on how they write the bill. It's a pretty technical difference, so we won't know yet until we see that language.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anna. Here's another one. So what has RFK Jr. had to say about the Trump administration's attack on our legacy and old growth forests and public lands?
I have not heard him make any comments about that. I do think like raising the health benefits of forests is another great thing that we can do, not only for clean air, but like mental health as well and recreation. So I think it's an angle we can take. But to my knowledge, I haven't seen any news about him weighing in. I don't know if Leah, if you've seen anything.
I haven't seen any RFK specific stuff, but I do think this also goes in the category of things you probably all are aware of. But if you've seen who's been picked out as heads for these agencies, we have plenty of room for shenanigans with the people directly in line, unfortunately, when you look at our new head of like BLM and DOI, and all of these things are deeply worrying, given the track records that these people have on these issues.
Okay, great. And I think I'm expecting the person who asked the question thought that maybe RFK would have helped us out a little bit. Is that right, Missy? Okay, I'm gonna just guess because
that was my thought, just because, you know, he was involved with Waterkeeper for so long. He's an environmental lawyer and activist, and I would have thought he would have talked Trump out of this.
I haven't seen him come out with any statements on this, not to say that they don't exist, but none have come across my plate so far.
okay, interesting question. So another person was asking, do you have the link to the survey of Trump and mega supporters of public lands versus ONG?
Yes, I can find that. There was a whole presentation done, and there's a lot more statistics in addition to just that one that are really interesting to dig through. So let me see if I can find that here while we're still talking. And if I can't in that time, I'll make sure it's included in the follow-up email.
Okay, great. So I'm going to focus on specific questions. So if you have a statement, I'm going to skip that, but that's great. You can keep putting your statements in, and then feel free to add your questions. So I have another question here, which is, are your advocacy materials emphasizing the critical water benefits of forests?
Yes. I don't know. They tend to be like fairly kind of high level, like here are the bullet points. So it is a bullet point, but so is everything else, if that makes sense. Like we talk about how all of like our watersheds in the Northwest, so many of them are based in these places, and they're critically important, especially the riparian areas within these zones, to the cleanliness, how clean our water is.
So if I can speak to this,
Yeah.
I've been finding I'm in the East, but I've been doing research on these benefits for a bunch of years, and I just feel like our messaging is not making enough of the importance that half of the rainfall we receive on land comes from forests, and that if we continue cutting our forests, we are cutting off our fresh water supply that feeds us. And I think, you know, this shouldn't just be a bullet point. This should be at the top of everybody's list, because this is a way to get people's attention. The fact that we are destroying our on-land rainfall is going to affect every single person, whereas recreation and habitat are not big ticket items for a lot of people. Our water that provides our agriculture to us, basically no trees, no water, no food. That's something really important that needs to be emphasized in the messaging. And a little farther down, I've included one of my favorite slides that shows the water cycle. And then the report that it comes from is listed below. So if people can take a look at those, take a look at that slide that is showing many of the numbers of benefits of forests and trees to bringing water inland. I mean, basically, we don't have rainfall inland without forests, and people don't know that. This is something that we can be messaging to people all over the country. In the Midwest, if we don't have our coast, if we do not have forests coming from the coast inland to the center, we do not have rainfall in the center of the continent unless you get a hurricane that goes across. That basically it leapfrogs, that the moisture leapfrogs through green, through forests into the interior of the continent. And that if the more we are cutting down and degrading our forests, we are taking away our fresh water. We're also taking away the capacity to store the fresh water. That's part of the rain cycle.
No, I think that's a great point, Kate. Thank you for bringing that up. And I would like to clarify too, that when I say it's a bullet point, I mean in our toolkit for writing your comment, not in the Sierra Club's full stance. So that's just, as we're listing out major issues, it is included. But I love your explanation of the leapfrogging. I think is a really beautiful concept to remember as we're talking about the value of these places and what they
Right,
provide
and
to
if-
these communities.
And if you go to that image showing that is the slide that I put in there in the chat. So if everybody can, go to that link for the slide, it's a JPEG that I dropped in there. That shows the leapfrogging. And it just shows, this one slide that I found shows a lot of the benefits. And that report goes into more detail.
Okay, thank you so much. And also, if there's any other research you want to put in about water in the chat, that's fine. I think folks should be able to save the chat, I think. So feel
I got
free
a whole
to
list.
put in any other links. And we certainly are all passionate about water as well. So
Thank you.
and forests relationship to water, very passionate about that. So, okay, so we have another question that I found in the Q&A, which is, does Fix Our Forests Act change the management of national wilderness areas?
I would have to double check on the technicalities of the legislation. I do believe that that can create some emergency exemptions, but I think most of that is outside of wilderness areas. So I just don't want to say something that's incorrect. So I can double check and I can get back to everyone via email. But I think we're mostly concerned about protected public lands and national forests, but less so in wilderness areas, than in just the general national forest protected areas.
Okay, cool. Thanks for researching that, Anna. I really appreciate that. And here's another question for Anna specifically. How much of your outreach is being done to moderate Republican leaders, and how effective is it?
Yeah, so Sierra Club does have a few key relationships in our DC office with some moderate Republicans. I think it kind of depends on the issue area as well. On public lands and outdoor recreation, I think we have the most success with those offices because, again, the members themselves are passionate outdoor recreation enthusiasts, and they know that their constituents are as well. And we also see some positive work there, specifically with things like the Land and Water Conservation Fund or the Inflation Reduction Act funding, a lot of which goes to conservative districts and conservative communities, that funding. And so we do have some key moderate champs who are willing to stand up for those sorts of things. In forestry, I think it's a little bit more difficult because a lot of people just don't have the expertise to understand forest management, and Representative Westerman loves to say he's the only licensed forester in Congress, and people just kind of take his word as an expert, unfortunately. So we have less moderate champs in the forest space specifically. So I think our greater challenge there is really keeping the moderate Democrats in line, because they tend to think of forest management, especially those Western Dems that have a lot of timber in their districts. That's kind of like the issue that they think they'll be bipartisan on, and they'll work with Republicans on. And they tend to stick more to Democrats on climate, but they think of forestry as something they can compromise. So we're more in my space, more focused on holding the moderate Dems in line than really getting any moderate Republicans. But there are other avenues which we have some key offices we work with.
Okay, thank you. And that's a good point about recreation, especially at these times when some of the things happening are far beyond what potentially we were looking at in the past. Maybe some of the recreation would be affected even more. Is that true than in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. All of these, the kind of worst case scenarios that we're afraid of with the new people that have been established in Interior and BLM, and the thought of privatizing public lands, that will greatly impact recreationists, because they may not have access to those public lands, or they'll be severely degraded because they've been logged or mined. And so, yeah, it's all related. And the more we can make those connections, I think, and elevate that, the more we can help broaden the base of people who are engaging on these issues.
I think too, as we're engaging with these issues, really tying it into the local places. I think it becomes so much more personal when you realize that it's about the local place where you recreate. So as much as we can talk about the places that are important to us, to people who also utilize these places and the danger that exists to those specific places, I think it hits home a lot more to be like your river or that forest where you hike or that place where you go hunt, instead of just being like national lands as a kind of amorphous concept. I think is much better to bring it home.
Okay, great point, Leah. So another question is, does Sierra Club's campaign include a question about the USFS properly accounting for carbon emissions from logging and the transport and manufacturing of wood products?
So
Yeah,
yeah.
just generally
Mm.
and in a was for specific is I'm curious about the question.
Maya, I think I know what you're talking about, but do you want to elucidate?
I'm sorry, can you remind me? Hold on, I'm just
It
trying to
was the
find it.
second question, after you asked about the outreach, you also asked about the accounting for carbon emissions, which we know
Oh, yeah.
doesn't
Yeah,
properly
thank you.
typically include forests.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, I know that California is not counting logging related emissions right now and is being encouraged to do so. But I'm just wondering because, I don't know, someone else was asking about, whether the other states like Oregon, Washington do this, but California is just not counting the carbon emissions associated with logging. So it ends up looking like we're trying to do something to decrease emissions, but it's mathematically not working out. So I just wondered if that's something that Sierra Club has addressed as a, just part of the campaign.
Yeah, that would be something I would be curious to ask Sierra Club California folks specifically if they've engaged on that. I'm not sure. Leah, do you know, have you heard anything about that?
No, I know that in the context of the Northwest Forest Plan, we're trying to get them to engage more on accounting for carbon at all, like the value of forests for carbon storage, and how that is something that even in the coldest sense translates to numbers. Like there is an economic benefit to having these forests and to keeping that carbon storage, and kind of pushing for more of the actual calculation of that and the benefit, not just being like, what is the timber profit to the economy? But I don't know about the logging transport piece specifically. I would have to look into that. Because it
Okay,
is
that's great.
industry.
Yeah, and a number of the folks, some of the folks on this call are from Sierra Club California. So I don't know, Karen, do you want to, I think Maya is from Sierra, Maya probably is aware of what is going on in California, but she's likely wondering what's going on at the national level regarding carbon accounting. But Karen, did you want to talk about any of Sierra Club California's interest
Well,
in carbon accounting? Yeah.
I could just say that Maya and I and others went to a conference a workshop that CARB did about carbon accounting a couple weeks ago, and Sierra Club California is submitting some comments that Maya was very instrumental in writing. So we're working on that, but I don't know if there's anything specific beyond that. We're in California, we're very aware that CARB is not, the inventorying that they're doing on carbon for forests is not accurate. I think they're aware of it also. They're trying to prove it, but we still see issues with it. And I think you're right, Krista. She was wondering what's happening nationally.
Okay. Great. So just a few more questions here. Do you two have a few more minutes just to answer the last questions in the Q&A that came in?
Yeah, I have a couple more minutes. I have
Okay.
to eventually, but
I'll try to go quick. These are fast ones, I think. First of all, where are the California, Oregon, and Washington senators Schiff, Padilla, Cantwell, Murray, Wyden, and Merkley on being educated on the Northwest Forest Plan and their leanings?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that there has been some outreach to those offices by the Sierra Club chapters, as well as groups like Oregon Wild and other groups that are specific to that region, throughout the process. But I haven't heard recently kind of where each office stands. So I think that's something that we have considered on some of our team calls. whether we should do a letter or try and get some congressional meetings just to double check that. They're all definitely aware of the Northwest Forest Plan and aware, especially the senators that have been around for a long time, maybe even remember like when the Northwest Forest Plan was created. But I definitely know that we want to do additional touches with them to make sure that they're aware of some of our key concerns. Leah, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I would say that we have been scheduling those out and are about to be doing a lot of that. A lot of these people already do know about our issue, but we want to check back in, partly just so that we're continuing to express that concern, especially for those senators who have been around longer. And then we do have some freshman representatives in this area, so trying to educate them on these issues and why these issues are important is part of that outreach plan as well. But more of like a, we're working on and about to do that, and less of a like, can tell you exactly their stance on it currently.
Perfect. Perfect. That's great. Thank you. Okay, so just 2 more questions in the Q&A. So what are the differences in the 3 states GHG, I guess that's greenhouse gas regulations or laws for greenhouse gas accounting on forests? Oh gosh, it sounds like it might be a big question, but do you have any conceptualizations of what the 3 states, like if that's Oregon, Washington, and California, how they differ on any GHG regulations or laws on accounting on forests?
I definitely don't have that expertise. I can check with our climate team and see if they have any resources about that. Because we do have a really big climate team as well that knows a lot more about the greenhouse gas emissions and things. So I can check with them, but I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question, though. It's good that we're all thinking about these things. So the final question is biochar production and in-stand application considered in the Northwest Forest Plan EIS?
I don't think biochar is referenced at all. Correct me if I'm wrong, Leah.
No, I don't believe there were any specific references to it within the plan.
Okay, is anyone's question that they put in the chat or Q&A, is there anyone's question who hasn't been at least asked? Okay, thank you so much for everybody for attending and for asking your questions and for listening. And thanks for being so interested to advocate on these important initiatives. I guess I'll give it back to Leah and Anna just to say any final words, and then we'll close with Karen.
Yeah, mostly just I'd love to get those links to you all so that we could email them out to people, and then start wherever feels easiest. If you just do one thing, I think so often it can be feel like overwhelming feeling, and it can take a lot to get to that first bit of momentum. So if you haven't been able to engage on some of these things, certainly encouraging you to do whatever feels easiest. If you're someone who's deeply involved, maybe that next step is bringing in more people, and we would love to support you all in doing that. So if we can be a resource.
Yeah, thanks for joining everyone. And just remember to keep getting outside and keep doing the things you love in parks and forests as well. I think that's a big part of the resisting and of advocacy is allowing yourself that mental space and reminding yourself, why we're fighting for these places. So don't stop doing that either. And yeah, if you have any questions as well, Leah and I are available via email, and we want to help you guys get engaged. So please do reach out.